Welcome, everyone. I heard that there's a long line to get into the parking garage, so you all that are here on time get to hear me talk a little bit, but other people might be trickling in. My name is Lisa Ben-Shia, and I'm the manager of our travel program here at the museum. It's a pleasure to see you all here today and to welcome Nigel McGilchrist, who's here visiting from Greece, and it's our great delight to have him here to lecture at the museum. Since this is an Armchair Travel lecture, which is aimed to take you on a virtual trip on this cold, for Santa Barbara, cold winter afternoon, I feel compelled to tell you a little bit about what travel programs we have coming up. We have outside, if you're interested, a Portugal brochure hot off the press. It hasn't even been sent to our membership yet. And it takes place in September at the most beautiful hotels in Porto and Lisbon and Sintra. This one in the background there is the Sintra Hotel, which I actually visited, and it's just dreamy. It's wonderful. And the tour includes an evening Douro River cruise, which Condé Nast just came out and said that it's a 2019 must-do activity, and that it's one of the most beautiful rivers to cruise, yet one of the most unknown to American travelers. The trip also has fantastic private home visits and unique access. It's really something special. For those of you who have traveled with the wonderful and soon-to-be retiring Susie Orso, this tour is organized and led by her colleagues, and it has her mark all over everything, so you can imagine how special it is. Equally special is our tour to Santa Fe in May. It has the most terrific private visits as well and special touches. And the base is the top-notch Rosewood Inn of the Anasazi, which is the best place to stay in Santa Fe. So it's 5 nights based at that hotel, and that will be a really great one. There's a few spaces open on that tour. And before I move on to this, we also have our overnight trips with Nigel McGilchrist, and those of you in the front row are coming down with him to LA for an overnight trip. We're doing 2 back-to-back trips, and the second one, which is actually this Wednesday to Thursday, does have a few spaces available if anyone wants to join at the last minute. The first one is full. And we have another Armchair Travel lecture next Saturday. This is with Dylan Turk. He's a curator and architectural historian at the Crystal Bridges Museum of American Art in Arkansas. And he's a young, vibrant speaker. He will speak on Southern California architecture because in the fall, he'll take a group of museum members down to Southern California to go to, among others, you'll see up here the Sheets Goldstein residence, the Eames House, the Frank Lloyd Wright's Hollyhock House, and Frank Lloyd Wright's Ennis House. So you won't want to miss the lecture next Saturday, and you can buy your tickets for this lecture at the admissions desk after this lecture if you wish. Oh, and we also handed out a survey. We would love to know your thoughts or your feedback if you plan to travel with us on what you would like to do in 2020 as we put the final touches on our travel schedule. There's that one that I was looking for. That's the overnight trip that we'll do with Nigel to the Getty Villa, the Getty Center, and that's the hotel that you all will stay in right on the beach in Santa Monica, Shutters on the Beach. Doesn't it look beautiful? And on to today's lecture. Nigel McGilchrist got his start as an art historian at Winchester College in England and then at Oxford University. He worked for the Italian government's Ministry of Arts as a consultant in fresco conservation when the Vatican was embarking on its controversial cleaning of the Sistine Chapel. In the 80s, he worked with Federico Zeri, who was J. Paul Getty's closest art advisor. Nigel was director of the Anglo-Italian Institute in Rome for 6 years, taught at the University of Rome and the University of Massachusetts, and was for 7 years the Dean of European Studies for a consortium of American liberal arts colleges. He lectures widely at museums and institutions in Europe and the US. He arranged this visit with us here in Santa Barbara in between 2 lectures that he just did at the San Diego Museum of Art, and he's on his way to Washington, D.C. after this to lecture at the Smithsonian. Nigel served on the board of editors of the Blue Guide series and contribute to several of their guides, and came out with his McGilchris Greek Islands, which is a multi-volume set, very comprehensive, wonderful guide to the Greek islands, and it was included in the Economist list of best books in 2010. And then after getting to know over 60 Greek islands intimately, he made the move in 2014 from Italy to Kythera, Greece, where he lives now. And many of you on the audience are going with Nigel to Greece this June, and you'll actually visit his island, Kythera. But today's talk is on Palmyra, in modern-day Syria, an important site in antiquity with wonderful ruins that were largely damaged by ISIS after they occupied the area. We're so fortunate to have Nigel, who has been to Palmyra 3 times, to bring alive a place that was so tragically devastated. Nigel was introduced to SBMA by his friend and ours, the travel writer Pico Iyer, whom he studied with at Oxford, where Pico said that Nigel was by far the most brilliant of their class. And Nigel has since led many tours for the SBMA, including to Greece, Turkey, Sicily, several to mainland Italy, Holland, and Belgium, a few to Asia, and more. And often people will ask me if a study leader is like Nigel, to which I reply, no one is like Nigel. Today's lecture is made possible by the Curletti Fund, and a reminder to please silence all your cell phones. And without further ado, please join me in welcoming the one and only Nigel McGilchrist.
Well, I feel like one of those, I think they're called emoticons, the one that's blushing. Your words are very kind, Lisa. Thank you very much. If it weren't 2 days after the event, you would be my Valentine for saying such lovely things. And, I'm always happy when I come to Santa Barbara. It's a lovely place, and thank you for your support. Lovely. And for inviting me. And I'm obviously grateful for Pico, who's very exaggerated in what he says about all things, but certainly about me, for introducing me to Santa Barbara, and very grateful to Shelley Ruston for initiating this. She was Lisa's predecessor in the travel program, and she began this. So I'm very grateful to her. I see her somewhere here in the audience there, and to Lisa, and of course to Jill Finston, who very sweetly kind of kept the pot boiling and organizing lectures as I, over the years. So I'm always through. Like the poet Wordsworth said, my heart leaps up when I see in my inbox an invitation to come to Santa Barbara. I've just been in San Diego. I arrived actually on Wednesday in the middle of a rainstorm, and it poured and poured and poured with rain in San Diego. And, I don't know whether it did that here, all day Wednesday and Thursday. And I thought, that jet-lagged phase that one is, I thought, it's the wrong coast. Or have we landed in Chicago? Or worse still, have we gone back to London? But anyway, the weather is sort of cheered up now, so things are looking up. So to turn our attention to Palmyra, and which is a very, very, very beautiful place. As I say, I first went in the mid to late 70s, and then again in the 80s, and then again in the 90s. I think I've been 3 times. And of course it's now all of us, it's sort of tinged with tragedy and melancholy, because some of its greatest monuments have been deliberately destroyed during the last sort of Syrian war. And they'll probably be reconstructed, but a reconstructed building is never the same as an original, and it's something has been lost. So, in fact, I'm going to talk a little bit and then show some images from on a PowerPoint. But I also brought some slides which I took way back in the 80s, and if you remember what transparencies were, the machine, the hum and the like, I'll show you them, and then you have an idea of how beautiful it was back then. Still a wonderful place, and let's hope one day it becomes peaceful again. To understand anything about Palmyra or about the importance of Palmyra, you have to understand a fundamental fact about Roman history. And it's that as Rome got older and ceased to be a republic and then became an empire, it became interested and then fascinated and then became dependent upon and then latterly became obsessed with its east, with its eastern portion, with the East in general. And the ultimate proof of this is, of course, that the Roman Empire was succeeded by Christianity, which was a religion which came out of the Near East. The East is fundamental in forming Roman and subsequent history, and the relations between Rome and the East, which have, for many, many years, if I saw academic prejudice have not really been looked at, are the key really to understanding Rome. Let me give you an example of this. In the year 248 AD, Rome had a birthday. It was a very important birthday because it was Rome's 1000th birthday. It was founded in 753 BC, nominally, and in 248 it was 1,000 years that from a tiny little town on the shores of on the banks of the Tiber had grown into the greatest imperial power in the world at that time, or in the Western world, let's say. And that was something to celebrate. The emperor who organized the celebrations, the emperor who was on the throne, was a man called Marcus Julius Philippus, known to us as Philip the Arab. And this is the irony, and not just the irony, but the very revealing thing about Roman history, that when it celebrated 1,000 years, the emperor on the throne was a Syrian. He came from Syria, a small town not far from Homs in Syria. He'd risen up through the army, a good, reliable, pragmatic man. And it was he who organized this great festival to celebrate 1,000 years. And certainly, the founders of Rome would never have believed, they wouldn't even have known where Syria was, but they would never have believed that they would one day be ruled by a Syrian, and not a Syrian as an occupier, but most importantly, as a Syrian, as a Roman, because he was a Roman, Marcus Philippus Julius. Yeah, we know him as Philip the Arab because he was an Arab, but he was in the inclusive world of the late Roman Empire. He was a Syrian. The other thing which is really important about Philip the Arab, which is generally ignored by historians, is that he was a Christian. There is a certain amount of debate about this. Some people deny this, some people say it's absolutely certain. It seems to me, on weighing up the evidence, which I won't go into in detail now, that he clearly was a Christian, but he was a very canny and pragmatic man, and he didn't flaunt his Christianity. Paganism remained the state religion, and he wasn't into the job of upsetting the apple cart. Of course, history attributes the first Christian emperor, the person of Constantine, and Constantine it was who made it actually publicly acceptable to be Christian, and of course also moved the capital of the empire to the east. There's the single biggest evidence of how important the east was to Rome. Moving the capital to Byzantium. I mean, imagine, the President of the United States does many strange things nowadays, but imagine if he wanted to move the capital to wherever. Yeah, I'm hearing some suggestions, but and his motives, if he did so, might well be the same as Constantine's, because Constantine found the Senate, in his case, an intolerable block to what he wanted to do. So he said, if you're not going to cooperate, I'm off, and I'm taking the court with me, and we're going to Byzantium, and the rest is history. Now, if we can have just a first image, just lights down and a first image. Well, do I need to do it here? Or? No. Oh, there we are. No, we want, whoops. Always like a map, but it's gone. Okay. Oh, no, right. There we are. Marcus Julius Philippus, Philip the Arab, the man who presided, a face that you might well see in Syria to this day. And when you look at the Roman Empire, one realizes that, it really, there were emperors, Trajan, very great emperors, Trajan and Hadrian, that came from the west, from Spain. But that as time went on, Rome just found itself very, very marginal in its own empire, because all its wealth and its military activity depended on here. And principally its wealth. Pliny complained about this. He said the exchequer of Rome is just bleeding out of Rome towards the east. All the luxury goods, all the spices, all the materials, all the things that Rome spent huge amounts of money on came from the east. Its whole center of gravity was here. But on its eastern border was the Parthian Empire, another great empire, territorially not as large maybe as the Roman Empire, but of course far older, far deeper and more rooted. The Parthian was just the latest at that point incarnation of Mesopotamian, Persian, a culture which is really unbroken and goes back 5,000 years. So it was a very, very ancient culture, and it formed the greatest stop to Roman expansion to the east, because the Emperor Trajan did take Roman forces to the Persian Gulf. He was the first emperor ever to stand on the Persian Gulf, who had also stood on the Atlantic coast as well, and therefore, had visited the entire span of his empire. But his achievements there were soon pushed back by the Parthians. It was a very, very difficult relationship, indeed. At times, the Romans had to deal with this in military defeats, sometimes military advances, and sometimes actually pragmatic peace agreements. This figure kneeling here with his cape very dramatically is Philip the Arab, the person I've just been talking about, the person who was on the throne at the 1000th birthday. Here seen kneeling before Shapur the great emperor of Parthia at the time. And there's a figure standing in the background here who was one of Philip's predecessors, the Emperor Valerian. Valerian was defeated massively by Shapur's army and was taken prisoner. And he was the first Roman emperor to be taken prisoner live. And he was taken around by Shapur. He was put in a cage some of the time, and he was exhibited, and this was a huge humiliation for the Romans, huge humiliation. And Philip's response to this was to deal pragmatically and actually to sue for a peace treaty with Shapur. And this is obviously a Persian relief, may well have been carved by Roman artists, however, under Persian rule, under Persian direction, in order to illustrate this occasion. I say that because 70,000 Roman soldiers were captured after Valerian's defeat. And the Persians were not into sort of executing soldiers or maltreating them. They put them to work, and they were sent all over the Parthian Empire, the Persian Empire, and they were put into building dams, building bridges and all that, because the Romans were good engineers. The Persians used that, and that's one of the reasons why there is so much fusion of culture in that area as we go towards the east of Persia and Afghanistan, between Roman and Greek world and the Eastern world. I mean, there are all kinds of things going on there. Well, in between the green Parthians here and the pink Romans there, of course, is a buffer zone. And right in the middle of it, of course, is Palmyra, technically in the Roman, under the Roman umbrella, because it was a sort of like a client state to Rome, but very, very useful and very important to Rome, because it was one of the few cities that had a standing army in the area, and it was on a very, very sensitive border. We know a bit about sensitive borders at the moment. They tend to be in the news, but that was a particularly sensitive one for the Romans in the East. Just a small digression on maps, because it's so easy to talk about history through maps and to show maps and to explain strategy in terms of maps. But we always forget when we do that certainly in the ancient world, and certainly in the medieval world, in the Renaissance world, and right up until the 16th century, they had no maps. They had no conception of what the world looked like. They didn't have this satellite view, which we immediately have. If I say China to you, you see that funny bulbous shape on the east end of. If I say France, you see that funny sort of trapezoid thing. We think as a satellite. We are so used, so ingrained in us to think in terms of maps that we forget that for the most of history, human beings have had no idea where mountain ranges and lakes and how things related, or where their campaigns, their military campaigns were going. And when people talk about Alexander's great campaigns and how he went into the east and he went as far as the Indus, modern day Pakistan, all that kind of thing, he had no map. He had no clear overall idea where he was going. He went stage by stage, and people would tell him about the next stop. But don't think Alexander had a plan. He wasn't sort of rolling out a map on a table and going, well, we'll move here and there. Nothing like that at all. And it's really important that we remember that, because the only map that has come down to us in one form from antiquity is this very venerable scroll, 23 feet long, which is why it looks a little bit thin on the screen, called the Putinger Tabula, which is in Vienna. And it's an interesting thing. It's a perfectly well preserved, apart from this left-hand end here. There's been a bit of, this is Great Britain here, there's been a bit of Brexit. It's sort of leaving. There's been a bit of a problem there. There's always a problem. We'll just let them do their thing. It's very, very well preserved. It was probably done in the actual thing itself is probably 12th century, 1100s, and it was a copy of a 4th century AD map, which was based on a map of the period of the first emperor of Rome, Augustus. So it's a copy of an original Roman map. But as you see, very, very, very long thing. This is the Brexit end of things. Here's Britain, Caledonia there, Scotland, with a very vigorous wall right across there to keep the Scots out, very sensibly. But this has largely been this has been damaged and reconstructed, which is why it's of a different colour. Right in the centre of the map, if we were to go about 11 feet down it, of course, you have Roma, Caput Mundi, the centre of the world, with all its consular roads leading out, in this case, down the peninsula of Italy, with the Adriatic and the Croatian coast there, the North African coast there. Nothing like the sort of map that we would use, because their vision was linear, as it were. It was one place and then the next place after that. There was no overall synthesized view. And it's terribly important, whenever you read a history book and you read about campaigns prior to the 17th century, 16th century, remember maps. They have very little idea about it. Now, just to show you that we know that this is based on a 1st century map originally, if we go down the west coast of Italy, you come to Naples here, and then it's actually difficult for you to see Herculaneum or Plontis, and you probably, I can hardly read it, but I do know that says Pompeii. And since Pompeii was destroyed in 79 AD and nobody knew it was there anymore until the 18th century, that means it was based on something that was written prior to 79 and the eruption of Vesuvius. When we get to the extreme right-hand end of the map, then we come to India, and this island here called Taprobane, which is the Latin name for Ceylon or Sri Lanka. So that was the extent of the Roman world. And what that is it's a road map, really. It just tells you how where the next place is down a particular road. But what interests us is that there's a big, whenever there's an important sort of city, a lot of sort of Facebook likes, you get a big thing like that, which is Antioch. Very important Roman city in Syria, Antioch in Syria. There's the river Orontes. And then as we come down this road, Palmyra there, 2 little houses. That means it's sort of moderately important. It's a real sort of staging post, those ones as opposed to these others that are there. So Palmyra appears on this map. Everywhere that was known in the Roman world appears, but it just isn't integrated into anything that we would call a map. So let's return to our own modern sort of satellite vision of things, and you see Palmyra there, right in, you see its strategic position geographically now. I showed you historically before as a buffer between the Persian Empire, and the Roman Empire, and of course it's geographically here, the Euphrates, joining with the Tigris further down, and then obviously all the trade routes that go to India and to the east, and the Mediterranean, where things could then be shipped to Rome, which was where the main market was. Though the Roman world in general was a big market. So this presented a useful, not always the best, but a useful staging post in an otherwise completely bleak desert steppe between a major line of communication, the Euphrates River, and the ports of the Levantine coast of the Mediterranean, and of course the third city of the Roman Empire, Antioch, because the second city was Alexandria in Greece, another very important trading entrepot. And even though so Palmyra appears as a very important city, really, for the Romans, and its wealth really accrues in the 100s, the 2nd century AD, because up until then, another kingdom further south, Nabatea here, modern-day Jordan, and the great city of Petra, rose-red city, half as old as time. Petra was one of the great trading, they dominated really trade routes, but once the Romans had taken over the Nabateans after a revolt, Petra lost its primacy on trade, and Palmyra filled the gap afterwards. It was good because this area could be, going up here and then across to Aleppo and like that, could be quite dangerous. And according to the security, merchants would move, they always wanted the safest route. And as I mentioned just earlier, one of the extraordinary things about Palmyra is that it had a standing army. The Romans allowed it to do that. It was a client state. It had sort of freedom to raise its own taxes. It had its own standing army, so it was able to protect its own trade route. So it was a kind of rather arduous hop and a skip from there across the desert to Palmyra and then on to the coast of the Mediterranean. And thereby geographically and historically, between the Parthian and the Roman empires, begins the importance and the significance of this town. Palmyra wouldn't exist, and nowhere exists in the ancient world, if it doesn't have fresh water. And the extraordinary God-given gift of Palmyra is that it has an amazing source of water, a spring called Efka, which supplies this huge oasis. And in the middle, you travel from any direction. You travel across completely waste steppe with nothing growing. Only in the spring are the tiniest little flowers, but otherwise nothing at all. And then suddenly you come across this huge green patch, oasis in the desert, which is fed by a spring which just turns out, I can't remember the statistic now of how many 100,000 litres every hour of fresh water in the desert. An extraordinary Fresh water is the basis of civilization, and it makes a difference on a Greek island between an island that's inhabited and one that isn't. If there's no fresh water, then nobody will go there. Oh gosh, I'm afraid the colour really, this is the problem. You'll see, my slides later on are maybe a little bit dark, but at least they have real colours, whereas, digital images can be off. But anyway, there you've got the oasis in the background, and then this magnificent remains of a really important trading post, Palmyra. And when you look at it like that, you think, that's a fairly familiar place. It's so recognizably Graeco-Roman. Those columns, those walls, those arches, those sort of capitals and things. Everything looks relatively, familiar. And that was the extraordinary thing about the Graeco-Roman world, that there was this veneer, this architectural veneer on the surface of similarity. But the underneath, of course, there is a completely different Semitic culture. And that's one of the things that those of you who are coming to Los Angeles to look at the little exhibition in the Getty will begin to explore this fact that there's extraordinary sort of layers of this. On the surface it all looks very Graeco-Roman, but underneath is a language and a culture which is really altogether completely different. This was dependent, obviously, on the rightly called ship of the desert, the most crucial animal for this area, first domesticated probably around in the 3rd millennium in Arabia, but an animal of extraordinary, it gets a very bad write-up in the West. People poo-poo it as a sort of, an unpredictable and aggressive and grumpy and stubborn animal. And camels can be like that, so can mules also, but they have extraordinary resistance, and they can eat almost anything and survive on it, and they are able to control their body blood temperature, or at least allow it to raise so that they can support heats much greater than other animals. Well, these were the population of Palmyra, apart from the human beings, and they were carrying a constant flow of goods to and fro between East and West. The East is unbelievably important for us. I mean, I think those of you who came to Japan with me, I think I mentioned this. If you just think in an average day, the things that we consume, 90% of them, the origin comes from Asia and the East. You may begin your day with orange juice and coffee or tea. Tea comes from China, coffee comes from Arabia, oranges and lemons were only brought into Europe and then further into America, coming from the Arab world. The plants in our gardens, our azaleas, our rhododendrons, our trees and flowers are all Eastern. The cottons, the silks, the things that we wear. We're totally dependent still to this day on Eastern things, even the simplest things in our life, like what we have at breakfast, things that came in origin from the Eastern world, and even more so in Rome. Rome just found itself wholly dependent. And of course, when you have economic dependence on an area, you start to have military interest there and political interest there, and that's what results in the end in the capital of the greatest empire of the Western world, the Roman Empire, decamping and moving to what we now call Istanbul on the Bosporus, when Constantine the Great created New Rome, Nova Roma, Constantinople, which is now Istanbul. Some of the things that were most commonly traded in Palmyra: Tyrian purple, very, very important pigment. It comes from the coast of Lebanon, Tyre. One of the great sort of entrepôts for trading it. This very, very beautiful color. It's not it can be, if it's if pieces of textile are dyed and re-dyed, it can become a very deep color. But there it is. There's just some raw wool, cotton thread dyed with that, with Tyrian purple, sort of product of the hyperbranchial gland of a little mollusk that needs to be extracted in very large numbers. Raw jade coming from China. This was a very important thing in Palmyra. Textiles, particularly from the Afghan, North Indian, Persian area, great fashion for them in Rome. Those were traded there, and rather less glamorous than any of those things. An awful lot of salt coming from the Persian Gulf, from what we would call the Gulf states now. So that's some of the things. But there was products from the West. The Chinese had a penchant for Roman glass, and a lot of Roman glass has been found in archaeological studies and digs in China. So there was trade contact, but it's not very well documented except for the things that we find. But Roman glass was something that the world appreciated very much. So that was something that was going out. They passed on also amber, which came then uniquely from the shores of the Baltic, amber and glass and wine and paper and things like that. But these were the things that they were after. And this required a very large sort of community, diaspora of Palmyrines who managed the trade routes in the Persian Gulf. In Rome, in Ostia, there was a small Palmyran community there. Down on the coast of India, there were Palmyran. The Palmyran script has been found. And this rather interesting thing comes from Newcastle upon Tyne, right in the north of England. Actually, it was found in when they excavated the car park for the Morrison's supermarket in Newcastle. Morrison's is rather like a thing, they do just frozen goods. They're sort of a kind of like I don't know what the equivalent is in the States. And they had a car park, they dug and they found some remains, and amongst it, lo and behold, a Palmyrene script up here. That's Palmyrene script. Those of you coming to Los Angeles tomorrow with me will see that. And down here, a Roman inscription saying, this commemorates Regina, I think you can probably see, who was a British lady. Her name was Regina, a British Roman lady, and her husband was a Palmyrene merchant, conjugi, and then it goes on, Palmyrinus there. So, for some reason, there were Palmyrans even up at Newcastle upon Tyne, and there is the evidence of it. So there was a big diaspora which protected and facilitated and promoted this trade which was funneling through the city of Palmyra. So, a very rich city. It was governed largely by an oligarchy, because this is the world of the Bedouin. And so it wasn't a monarchy, Palmyra. It was run by a sort of oligarchy, if you like, of tribal chiefs of the various Bedouin tribes of the area. But one of them obviously came to be more important than any of the others. And the tribal chief, called Odenathus, proved himself to Rome to be an absolutely invaluable military aid, because he managed to defeat Shapur, the Persian Empire, on a skirmish on the northeastern border of Palmyra's territory. And it was Shapur who had defeated and taken prisoner Valerian, the prisoner, and carried him around in a cage and exhibited him, and in the end actually had him flayed and sent his skin stuffed with straw sent back to Rome. So it was a terrible, terrible thing, that story. Well, Odenathus, the sort of Bedouin chief of this town, managed to defeat Shapur. So the Romans were very, very happy about that. They were doubly happy because they were very, very pressed at the time on their northern frontier. This is 265 AD, and it's the time of the beginnings of the Gothic invasions into the north of the Roman Empire. In other words, that very difficult border, the Rhine, the Danube, that separated sort of terra incognita, vast forest which covered Poland and Germany and all that, which the Romans were very leery about entering. It was their northern frontier that started simply to lose its protection, and the Gothic invasions were a big problem. They cost the Romans a huge amount in military expenditure, so they were very happy to have a man who did what Odenathus did. Odenathus was then assassinated by Persian assassins, and his young wife, who was called Zainab, or Zenobia as we call her now, took power. Some people have suggested, was she involved in the assassination of her husband? It's possible. You know, history loves powerful women generally and creates all kinds of stories about she may have been. It's not impossible. But Zenobia had a young son by Odenathus who was not of ruling age. He was a minor, and so she acted as the regent for Palmyra at the time. And knowing that Rome was busy on its northern frontier and had no interest in what was going on down in Palmyra at the time, she thought, right, this is the moment for me, we're on a roll now, to deal with her ancient tribal enemy, the Tanakh, who are people who live in what are now modern-day Jordan. So she set off with a campaign, large group of soldiers. Remember, Palmyra had a standing army. That was maybe something that the Romans should have sort of foreseen. And she won her campaign. And in the process, the Roman garrison was defeated there. And she found that Palmyra suddenly had control over a very large corner of the Roman Empire. All that area down sort of Nabatea, Jordan, you know, that southern area of the Middle East suddenly came under Palmyrene control. And then it went to her head, and she thought, you know, I am Cleopatra, so I will go to Egypt. And she defeated the Roman garrison of Egypt. I mean, this was unheard of, that some, you know, a client state would start causing trouble of this magnitude within the empire. So Palmyra, for this brief period in the 250s, 260s AD, found itself controlling a very, very large area, including Egypt with all its richness. It was a very short period, as we'll find out. But then she also moved north and into Turkey and went as far as Ankara, ancient Roman settlement there, and the Romans, you know, had to deal with it. And she, this is not actually a portrait of her, but it's often called a portrait of Zenobia. We don't actually have any, or for sure, portraits of her, except on coins. But this is a magnificent Palmyrene woman with this marvelous gesture. Not really a gesture of thought, it's actually a gesture of, did I leave it in the supermarket, or did I leave it in the car keys? I'm just trying to think. No, it's seriously, it's a gesture of loss. It's a grieving, you know, of loss. That, just as in ancient Greece, that is it doesn't mean I've just got out of bed. It means I'm grieving. So one has to learn to read these gestures. But it's a beautiful portrait. Let's imagine it is Zenobia, this wonderful woman who Gibbon, I think, describes, not in the bit that I've copied for you there, but he describes her, she clearly was, in the mold of Cleopatra, a very attractive and beautiful woman. Her face was dark and of a swarthy hue. Her eyes were black beyond the usual wont, and her beauty was incredible. So, that's Zenobia. Well, she didn't bargain on having this man, the Emperor Aurelian, as the person who moved to stop this explosion of Palmyrene power. Aurelian is the person who, if you've been to Rome and you've seen the massive walls around Rome, you'll know that they're called the Mura Aureliane. They're the Aurelian walls. Not because they were built by Marcus Aurelius, they were built by this man in the 250s and 60s. And the fact that Rome should have walls built round it at all is a sign that the end is nigh. For years and years, and for centuries, Rome had not had walls because it didn't need walls. I mean, its armies kept Italian territory so sacrosanctly safe that the idea of building walls was a sign that the end was near. Why were you laughing? I don't understand. Anyway, so she didn't bargain on having this man, not a man of great culture, but decisive and a good. I mean, he'd been a soldier a long time. He knew his trade as a soldier, and he moved, from the Gothic frontier. He relentlessly. I mean, he spent his whole time on the move. Came down to deal with Zenobia, and pushed her back into Syria, and confined her to the town of Palmyra, where she hastily began building walls to protect against a siege. And Aurelian was not really interested in a long campaign because Palmyra had very good cavalry. He was very aware that that was his weak point, was dealing with that. So he'd done a lot of harassing, and by harassing her army, he'd pushed her back into Palmyra. But then he sought to seek peace with her. And there's an exchange of letters which is recorded in what's called the Historia Augustae, and it goes as follows. From Aurelian, Emperor of the Roman world and recoverer of the East, to Zenobia and all others who are bound to her by alliance in war. You should have done of your own free will what I now command in my letter. For I bid you surrender, promising that shall all be spared, and with the condition that you, Zenobia, together with your children, shall dwell wherever I, acting in accordance with the wish of the most noble Senate of Rome, shall appoint a place. Your jewels, your gold, your silver, your silks, your horses, your camels, you shall all hand over to the Roman treasury. This was really important. He needed to finance those wars against the Goths. As for the people of Palmyra, their rights shall be preserved. So that's what Zenobia got in her inbox in the morning. The reply, from Zenobia, Queen of the East, to Aurelian Augustus. None save yourself has ever demanded by letter what you now demand. Whatever must be accomplished in matters of war must be done by valor alone. You demand my surrender, as though you were not aware that Cleopatra preferred to die a queen rather than remain alive, however high her rank. Notice always sort of returning to Cleopatra, who was a very important role model to her. And you have to understand Zenobia in that sort of context. We shall not lack reinforcements from Persia. That was something that made the Romans think twice, which we're even now expecting. On our side are the Saracens, on our side too the Armenians. The brigands of Syria have defeated your army, Aurelian. What more need be said? If those forces then which we are expecting from every side shall arrive, you will of a surety lay aside that arrogance with which you now command my surrender. So that was what Aurelian got in his inbox. So no peace dealing, as Gibbon describes in the bit that I've photocopied for you, which you might want to read afterwards. This is a wonderful Gibbonian language from his Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. She refused to treat. So the siege began, and it's recounted actually in the page. I don't actually have the photocopy, but if you look afterwards, you'll see that realizing that her number was up, that Aurelian had formed alliances with some of Palmyra's old enemies, or those who had sort of scores to settle with Palmyra. She realized her number was up. She tried to escape on a camel to go to Persia to solicit help from the Persians, from the Parthians, and she was intercepted at the Euphrates and brought back. And Aurelian was perfectly just about it. He didn't sack the city. He freed the people of the town. He just took the wealth of the town, as he had promised to do, as he threatened to do, and took Palmyra and her son captive. And a wonderful painting, actually in the National Gallery of New South Wales in Australia, by a German painter who naturalized as an Englishman. And his name, rather ironically, looking at this painting, his name was Schmaltz. Helmut Schmaltz did this wonderful and very famous sort of picture of Zenobia looking her last on Palmyra. Here, the great city, the city below, fire already sort of raging there, a Roman centurion ready to take her away, the army marching past there, and she is manacled, as you can see, in gold chains, and she was taken to Rome, according to the historians, and paraded in triumph, and then given a villa in the town of Tivoli, which sounds rather nice to me, and she lived in the hills there, and lived out her life there. I mean, we don't know for certain what happened to her, but that's what, the few historians who write about this say. So this was a moment of greatness, a very brief window of greatness for Palmyra, which then contracted. The problem was that Aurelian then left a garrison there, and the Palmyrans felt that they, could take advantage again. There was another uprising, and this time Aurelian returned, and he said, okay, this time it's enough. I'm going to give the city over to my army to sack, and the ruins, the city was sacked by the army. It was something that a triumphant general had to do sometimes in order to maintain popularity with his troops, which was fundamental. So, the ruins that we visit in Palmyra are already sort of had been ruined by the Romans, but then, of course, rebuilt. And what we see is a city, a very, very typical Eastern city. Why do I say Eastern? We've got certain architectural elements, like that, which you'd never find in the West, certain kinds of capitals here that are much more ornate. There's much more sort of palm leaves and all that. And remember, the name Palmyra is related to the palm. That's its, palmy city is really what its name is. But even the very, this kind of street architecture, this is a four-way gate. And the long colonnades, even though we think of them as a Roman thing, they're very much an Eastern version of Rome. You don't find colonnaded streets like you see there, and I'll show you again in just a moment. You don't find them in the Western Roman Empire. You don't find them in Italy, you don't find them in Greece. Great colonnaded streets don't exist there. They were an Eastern phenomenon. Strange. And this kind of what's called a tetrapylon, a four-way, it's a crossroads. And that's a sort of reconstruction of what it might well have been like originally, with the colonnade going down there. This is the sort of thing that would, any Roman seeing this would have felt the breeze of the East there and not recognized it as anything that could have been on Italian territory or in Spain. These figures here that are recreated by this artist here would have been the merchants, the rich people who subscribed to the building of the city. This is a mercantile center paid for by merchants. In fact, the Temple of Bel, which I'm going to show you in a moment, was paid for. We know the name of the man. He was called Mallet, and he paid for it. And these, the funeral architecture, of course, here again, another gesture of sorrow. That's what the lady before with her two fingers. It's a very beautiful, very moving, very tender gesture of sorrow. And when you look at this, it's a wonderful hybrid of Roman and Eastern flavors. In other words, the form, the face, the pose, the clothing, these sort of the toga and so forth are very Western. Yet all this elaborate the jewelry there and brooches, earrings, bracelets are very Eastern, and the hairstyle as well. The veil, on the other hand, covering the head, is typically Roman. So it's a sort of mixed. It's a patois, if you like, an artistic patois. And those famous portraits, which you'll be seeing tomorrow, some of in Los Angeles, were in burial chambers like this. These beautiful sort of little loculi here, with not really portraits in the way that the Romans would have done, because the Palmyrans never really could capture the portrait. They're sort of archetypal faces, they're timeless faces in a way. And we have quite a lot of texts carved in stone about how much these slots cost and how other people mustn't invade them and change them. There's lots of notarized Palmyrene documents about that. Notice this lovely ornate frieze along the top there. Well, the Temple of Bel, there were the religion in Palmyra was as syncretic and as complicated as its art and its language, and it has several temples to several different deities. This being the greatest one to a Babylonian deity, the Baal, the Temple of Bel, as it's called in Palmyra, and another great temple which now no longer exists is the Temple to Baal-Shamin, which was a Phoenician divinity. So there was, both Western and Eastern divinities within the same city. And it's interesting for us to look at the architecture, because the architecture itself obviously tells us about the nature of the cult. Even though the vocabulary of the architecture, the cult was completely different, but the vocabulary is still very Roman, or Graeco-Roman, with fluted columns and these beautiful friezes and architraves, but then with little Babylonian bits on top. It's an extraordinary mixture, so you're kind of a cocktail of different kinds of architecture. Very, very beautiful is the sort of the drill work. All this is, the egg and dart. This is pure Greek, but then all this is pure Palmyrene. These lovely palm fronds and these rosettes here. So there are elements that are Graeco-Roman, elements that are Palmyrene, but the net result is highly decorative. And when that was actually coloured, of course, as it originally was, these would have been picked out in a green against a sort of dark red background. It must have been a very, very glamorous and colourful effect, perhaps to our eyes a little bit gaudy. And this is a reconstruction of that temple, and it gives us an idea of the kind of worship that went on here, because the temple stands in the middle of a huge courtyard, a very, very large courtyard where people would gather for worship. And if you go to Syria today, you go to Damascus, the great mosque in the center of Damascus, it's a huge courtyard with the building to one side, the actual prayer hall. So we see the beginnings, and the continuation of Eastern worship even in this form. So quite different from the structure of a Roman or Graeco-Roman temple, which wouldn't have had this huge colonnaded courtyard around it. And temples in Iran to this, mosques in Iran have this form as well. Interestingly, of course, the Romans liked centrality, and in Palmyra, the Eastern taste, or the ritual required the doorway to be off-center. I'll show you this because I only have a slide of it just in a moment. This is the interior of the roof of the temple, which was still visible when I went in the 80s and 90s. This is a drawing of it, done by a 19th century French visitor. Very, very big. This is an enormous block of stone which was over the chamber in the interior of the temple. So it was probably over the figure of the deity. And these prints became very, very widely distributed in Europe. And Robert Adam, when decorating creating Osterley Park, one of the great stately homes near London, on the western end of London, sort of did an architectural decorative riff on that idea. There's the original, and that's Robert Adam's beautiful sort of version of it. This is the temple, smaller temple of Baal-Shamin, the deity that was of Phoenician origin. And it's here that we have to, unfortunately, move forward in historical terms, because in August 2015, that's what happened to that temple. So that was reduced to nothing by that. This is the terrible August of 2015, in which many, many atrocities happened, not just to the monuments, but also notably to the people who were trying to protect the monuments, namely the curator, the 80-year-old curator of antiquities at Palmyra, Khalid al-Asid, who was rather hideously assassinated in the process of trying to protect them. And the Temple of Bel, which I've just shown you a moment ago, with the great courtyard around it, that's all that remains of it now, just the one entrance arch. So, I mean, dramatically altered. So it would be nice, in a way, to finish on a happier note. So if you don't mind, and I don't know whether you remember these things, which were sort of projectors. Well, we've got one out especially for the occasion. When I first came to lecture in Santa Barbara, we used to do it with a slide projector. So now we're going to move to a slide projector and have some images of what Palmyra. I'm afraid they have darkened. Because they're old. They're from the 80s, I think. There we are. So these, I think, are not from my first visit from the 70s, but actually from the 80s. But when you arrive in Palmyra, and I just included this because it gives you a sense of the extraordinariness of this oasis in the middle of the desert. It is it's like Homer is right. The desert is the great unharvested sea. It is like a sea, and then there are islands in it, and this is an extraordinary island. All this, the city that we've just, there's the Temple of Baal, and now no more, and Baal Shemin over to this side. But a little bit of earth tremor there, but anyway. This is your first view you get as you come on the road from Damascus, with the desert stretching beyond to the Euphrates. And no, I'm pressing the wrong thing. I have to go to here. That's right. We're on different technology now. Yes. And you can see how it's not, none of the land around is at all fertile. It is real desert steppe, but with the oasis in the middle. And the oasis is all thanks to that. That's the spring of Efka. There you can see the castle up there above the city, and this is where the spring comes out. There's a huge amount of water, just cold, absolutely fresh water coming out of the floor of the desert. And that gives rise to this very lovely sort of winding streets of gardens, orchards with lemons and dates and oranges and all that. Miles of it, and then you come to the edge, to the desert. This is, some of the classic views of Palmyra as it was, the triumphal arch, an absolutely idiosyncratic and purely Roman architectural idea, with the colonnaded street, however. When you get an arch in Rome, you don't get a colonnaded street after it. It's a funny thing, but we think, all Roman towns must have had colonnaded streets. It's such a plausible thing, but it was the eastern ones that did. And on these parapets here, these different parapets would have been statues, massive statues of the important people of the town, the merchants who had paid for all of this. I actually found my, it's not, do you mind? I found this in a sort of suitcase, which was my journal, which I took in 1978 of my very first visit there. And I just sort of read a tiny bit from it, because I remember arriving late at night and going out in the evening, or the first evening into Palmyra. You could just walk straight out into it. And there were so many wild dogs, I took fright and returned to the hotel, because they were just you couldn't move for barking dogs. And in a place like the Syrian Desert, you don't know how safe the dogs are and what their behavior is going to be. It's not like walking in the park in Santa Barbara, exactly. And so the next morning I got up at 6. The sun was behind clouds with a steely light, bitter, cold wind blowing. Few people up. Set off alone. Crispin was ill. That was my travelling companion. He'd got some tummy bug and was ill and was still in bed. Sheer wonderment at it all, and the calm, cool light. Cuckoos were landing and flying everywhere. Remember that, these beautiful, almost Palmyra-coloured birds with their wonderful wings and crests and beaks. They were flying around. Wandered through the oasis, which you've just seen, with walls with groves of palms and olives. Long walk to the edge of the desert. I noticed how far it was to get how big the oasis was. The edge of the desert. Oh yes, and then when I got to the flowers were extraordinary at the edge of the desert. I was there, I think, in April, and the desert it had rained shortly before, and there were these tiny little flowers all over the floor. But I mean, those were some of my impressions of it. It was a very numinous place indeed. The theatre, destroyed also. This was the scene of the many of the mass executions that ISIS carried out. And then also of the Russian concert that happened after there was a break in, the city had been retaken. But this central part of the theatre no longer exists. That's been destroyed, but will, I'm sure, no doubt be reconstructed. Let me bring this out from there. There, the classic. You see this in Jerash, in Jordan. You see this in many, many of the eastern cities, these wonderful colonnades. Thank you for focusing it. That's lovely. This lovely tender light and the colour, beautiful colour of the stone, which is a result of patination. The stone itself is actually white, but then as it's exposed to the desert air and to oxygen over the times, it creates this lovely pink, very, very typical Palmyrene hue. And this is the Temple of Baal there, which now no longer exists. There's the main street again, more of these lovely arches. And you get a sense of the extent of it everywhere. I mean, there were just bits and fragments of decorative things still lying around. And then there's the Temple of Baal. And it's huge. That's the extent of the complex. You can see it was a very, very large area. There's the main entrance into it. All this is gone now. And there's the oasis in the background. See, the images are so much, even though they're a little bit dark, they're so much more beautiful than digital images, I find. That when you saw the photograph of it destroyed, that was the only thing that's still standing. All the rest has gone. Do you remember there was just a gate standing in the middle of the ruins? Well, that has survived somehow. And when we raise eyebrows at what ISIS has done here, we shouldn't forget that there are several accounts in different places of how at the end of the Roman Empire there were armies of black-robed sort of priests and acolytes who would tour around in the Roman Empire, destroying any pagan sculpture, any pagan temples that they could find. These were early Christian zealots who felt it necessary to express their religious credentials by doing damage to anything pagan. So, there's nothing new in history at all. And we must remember that, early Christianity was equally violent towards that which came before it. I don't know if that's one of the hoopoes caught in flight there, but anyway, these beautifully fluted columns. And now inside the church, I'm just going to show you the next slide, I think, is the piece of stone, a single stone, which forms the ceiling, which was the thing that Robert Adam turned into the ceiling of, the design of it into the ceiling of Osterley Park. And you can see it's blackened by fires, probably because shepherds for a long time have been sort of taking shelter in there. But you can see the beautiful quality of its design. It's already very, very Eastern, that geometric world. It's like the early Islamic art in a way. And the details, so different from anything you get in Rome, these wonderfully lush clusters of grapes and vine leaves. The Romans would have thought of this as rather decadent, but it is wonderfully decorative, certainly. The little tendrils beautifully done. And here is the Baal Shamin himself, who was symbolized always by the moon, and you can see a crescent moon, see there behind his neck. 2 points of the crescent moon there. And of course the crescent moon is the symbol of Islam as well, so one would need to follow the iconology there and see how that has developed. Pomegranates on his altar there. And beautifully in the decoration, in the decorative elements, these camels and figures here, all covered up against the stand of the desert, coming along in the train afterwards. Amazing, rather like Saudi women to this day, all covered over completely. Now, whether these things exist, I doubt very much anymore. I mean, I think those were all taken within the courtyard of the Bell Temple, and I imagine that they've all been irretrievably lost and detonated. And yes, just for the benefit of those who are coming to Los Angeles with me tomorrow, we'll be looking mostly at funerary architecture. This is what's called the Valley of the Tombs, distant from the city, which is, city is over the hill ridge there, so outside. These towers, which go all along the floor of the valley, were burial towers with, they were like skyscrapers full of those beautiful figures marking a little loculus where somebody would be buried. And some of the grander ones, this is from the museum in Damascus there, and I imagine that's still all right. A typical Palmyrene family, or sort of having a funerary feast, as it were, on top of a sarcophagus. And you see this extraordinary mixture. So you have a double take, because it is rather Roman, this sort of reclining or Romano-Greek on sofas with, like a symposium, and yet the faces are very Arab and very generalized. And there are many things that lead us both east and west within the same pieces of architecture. And just I wanted to finish with two or three slides, just not of Palmyra, but this is a Roman road through the desert, not far from Palmyra. It's in northern Syria. But you can see the quality of their building of a road. This has survived, a good almost 2,000 years. And you can see built up above the level of the desert with its gutter on the sides there, and this large piste, which was a very good surface for moving goods and moving armies rapidly. Roads were the secret of the Roman Empire in many, many ways, both for trade, for wealth, and for military dominance. And that road actually leads from this place, Apamea. These satellite photographs have shown that Apamea is now a whole series of holes where tomb robbers and illegal excavations have gone on, in people looking for works of art which could be exported and sold. And whether these columns are still standing, I don't know. We're not actually in Palmyra here. We're in somewhere just a little further to the west in Syria. But you only find in Syria this extraordinary spiral fluting. You do find them in Rome, but they've been brought from the east. It's a peculiarly Eastern thing, exceptionally beautiful. And Apamea is the sort of locus classicus for these columns. And we were talking about the early Christians, but this is a point. You're looking here. That is Turkey, and we're in Syria. A very, very hot border at the moment. But you're on an eminence, and it was here that one of the curious kinds of spiritual activity of early Christianity was born, the stylite movement. Let's just talk about the history of this just for one moment. Have we got enough time? Yes, so 5 minutes on this. In 313, there was a thing called the Edict of Milan, and Constantine said, at long last, after years of persecution, Christians were free to be Christians, and Christianity, furthermore, was to be promoted as the prime creed of the state. If you were somebody who felt your Christianity very, very deeply, and many of them sought martyrdom because that was a way of showing your stripes. Martyrdom was something that you, as an early Christian, you sought because it really showed to God and showed to the world that you were a real Christian. Suddenly, that avenue was no longer open to you. You couldn't be martyred because Constantine had said, that's all over. You're free to be Christian. So the real zealots of Christianity excogitated all kinds of ways to martyr themselves. In other words, to do self-martyrdom. In other words, to sort of walk around on the desert on all fours and just eat leaves, or to be chained to a tree and stand in the same position for 10 years or whatever. All these crazy things that we call early Christian anchorites, the desert anchorites, were thought up in this period as a way of showing you're real Christian, to separate you from the hordes of people who had just for convenience converted to Christianity. You were a real Christian because you mortified yourself in the name of God. Seems strange to us, but it was a consequence directly of the liberty of religion. Well, St. Simeon came here, and he was somebody who attracted people. He was a very good preacher, and because people thronged to him, a very important spiritual man, he thought, okay, well, they're always constantly wanting to touch me, and I'll sit on a stone. And he began on a 10-foot sort of stone, and then he could sort of talk to people. And in the end, the stone went up to 37 feet, and then up to 60 feet. And he became the first of a movement of stylites, people who sat on top of columns. And Simeon sat on his column, or was on the top of his column, for 27 years. He lived to the incredible age of 69. In this spot here, and I'll show you the exact spot in a second, in the winter, the snow here, the wind just blows across, could cut you in half, it's so cold. In the summer, it's boiling hot. Simeon sat there on his platform on the top. There's a little sort of shelf on the top. People would winch up food to him in a basket. But he was safe. He was safe. People couldn't get hold of him. And the site of St. Simeon and his anchorite episode was after his death, was turned into this church, or was surrounded by this church, St. Kalat-Saman, St. Simeon's Church. It's a magnificent piece of 5th century early Christian architecture. And when he died, all hell broke loose because everybody wanted a bit of him. This was terribly important. If there was a holy person and you could have a bit of him, a fingernail, a toenail, a shred of his coat or whatever. And the Bishop of Antioch arrived with a deputation of 600 soldiers and 3 other co-bishops and said, stop, he's ours, and took him off to Antioch. This is the extraordinary world of early Christianity. I'm not making this up. Simeon sat on a column for 27 years and died at the age of... At one point, the writers tell us it's Theodoret who tells us the story. He got a septic leg and an incredible number of worms would drop out. He was up there in this piteous condition on top of a column. Well, after it was all over, it was turned into this very, very beautiful church, which is there. And during the Syrian War, civil war, and during a Russian incursion in 2016, there was a direct hit on the column, which is in the center. Have I got a picture of it? Yes, there it is. And the church was very badly damaged. This is a piece of unique 5th century early Christian architecture. It's just caught in the crossfire on this very, very sensitive border between Turkey and Syria. That's all that remains remained in 1980 of Simeon's column. And what has remained of the church, who knows? We know maybe we should go, Santa Barbara, have a visit and see if we can find what remains. Well, it's probably TMI, too much information. You probably didn't all want to know about Simeon, but since, it's all part of this interesting, very interesting period in which paganism transfers to Christianity, and which the East and the West meet. It's where it all happens, really. Anyway, thank you for your patience and for listening. It's been a very long time, I'm sorry. I don't know whether anybody has any questions they want to ask, but I know we don't have long because I think we have to vacate the auditorium. And I'm sorry to have gone on longer than I should have done, but anyway, yeah.
Would there have been any plans for trees growing, for example,
No, I think there would have been the trees would all have been in the oasis area, in those gardens. Yeah.
So even when they were built, that was desert on the outskirts of the woods.
Yes, it was on the. It's true. You're right. It's on the edge of the oasis. The city is on the side, and then the oasis. Yeah. Because the sort of water-fed area was too precious for cultivation, so you built on the edge of it. Yes, that's a very good point. Yeah. Yes.
What are the materials of the architecture we saw? Some look like marble, some look like...
It's all a very humble sandstone, actually. Sorry, the lady was just asking what the material is. It's a very humble sandstone. Those of you who are coming to Los Angeles with me tomorrow will see that the actual stone out of which these faces are carved is a very white colour. And you say, well, that doesn't correspond to what's going on there. But when the stone is exposed to the atmosphere, it then goes, with time, it patinates with this lovely colour. Yes?
Are there any plans to reconstruct Palmyra?
Yeah.
Has it gone forever?
No, I don't think it's gone forever. Once hostilities, if hostilities finish, I'm sure it will be, because we live in a time when we do that, and it's a sort of money will be found to do it. But restore to what? How much can you restore? And do you restore it as a ruin, or do you? It's fraught with difficult questions. You had a temple there which was partially ruined, and a colonnade all around it, and then suddenly it's rubble. What do you start to restore? Do you restore it, take photographs and do it exactly as it was, so it's a kind of faux ruin, or it's difficult, but I'm sure, they're already talking about it.
And the water is still there?
The water, I think, is still there, yes. Well, I can't guarantee that, Keith. I don't know. It's a very good point, because in a serious war situation like this, somebody could.
I don't know where they're going to find the artisans to do it.
No, well, that's a very good point as well. To do it with machinery is not the same as to do it by hand. And the beauty of antiquities and the beauty of ancient buildings is that they were, the Greeks have started doing this a little bit in Greece, much to my dismay, in places like Epidaurus and so on. They're starting to reconstruct things with bits of sort of machine-made marble next to the, and it all looks. I don't know, but I'm a stick in the mud about that. I'm sorry. Yeah.
The photograph that you have of the Temple of Bel pre-ISIS.
Yeah.
There's an awful lot of stone just lying about that obviously fell apart from the building. Is that a result of previous?
Yes, that's a result of largely of earthquake. This is a seismic area, and stone buildings are the ones. It's the same story all over Greece and Turkey. These buildings, there are ruins all around because they've been shaken down. The ancients excogitated all kinds of ways of trying to prevent buildings from collapsing at tremors, and that was originally the columns were monolithic, and then they started making them in drums so that there was a little bit of give. That was one way of doing it, but an earthquake is an earthquake, and it will, So I think it's mostly earthquake, because I think after the Roman destruction, Aurelian's second visit, imagine going all the way down to Zenobia, to Palmyra the second time. It was too much. Do we have to finish? Yes. Yeah, we have to finish. Thank you very much indeed. I'm sorry to have been so long.